Hello, everyone. My name is Maryann Martone. I am a professor of neuroscience in the Department of Neuroscience at the University of California, San Diego. And I'm also a founder and have equity interest in SciCrunch, Inc., a startup out of UCSD that develops tools and services around reproducible science. The topic of this talk is the tyranny of formatting, and it's a little bit unusual title, but I also had a fairly unusual journey in coming to this place right now and giving this talk. So the tyranny of formatting was the name of a blog that I wrote in 2013, actually. It was the beginning days of when I started to blog, and I put it out there. I was blogging through Force 11, which I was a member of at the time. And a couple of months ago, Stephen Pemberton contacted me somewhat distressed because apparently he was a big fan of that blog and it had been taken down. Fortunately, because we have had advances in scholarly communications, I was able to locate a copy and I posted it in Zenodo in case anybody wanted to read it again. But of course, I was very flattered that somebody had noted that little piece that I had written all those years ago. And the tyranny of formatting was a name that came from a talk that was given at one of the Force conferences. And I'll talk a little bit about the background in just a second. But I was rereading it after I got the note from Stephen, and I was actually quite amused by what I had written, but it was still remarkably true. So here's how it started. It said, "It is 4 a.m. in the morning and the grant is due the next day. You have 12 pages to tell a story that will determine whether or not you can pay your salary and support your lab next year." I'm in the US and I'm on soft money, so I have to raise all my salary by grants. You delete a sentence on page 5. The document swells to 13 pages. Oh no, the figures have all jumped around. The next paragraph is now Courier 14 bold. You hit your head against the screen and spend the next hour trying to get everything back in place and the sentence deleted. The next day, you're tired, irritable, and have a broken computer screen. So this really, reflected the frustration that I often felt, and as I will tell you, still do feel when trying to conform to page limits for NIH grants. These things actually happen all of the time. And it wasn't just an NIH grants, but it was having to reformat and reformat articles for different publishers, formatting references in articles, and just the difficulty in text mining back in 2013 when you were trying to extract text often from PDFs or other uncomputable formats. So, I went through a couple of these anecdotes. And then at one point I said, isn't it time that we as scholars throw out our copy of Microsoft Word and say, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore? Has anyone tried to calculate the unproductive hours spent by scholars on formatting? Has anyone else been reduced to tears by jumping figures at 4 a.m.? Has anyone then asked why? And this is, you see, has a little bit of revolutionary zeal, and that revolutionary zeal back in 2013 reflected part of my journey as a scientist. I am a neuroscientist, as I mentioned, and with a specialty in neuroanatomy and neuroinformatics. So back in the 90s, when they were first starting up a lot of databases to contain scientific information, I left the lab, I left the wet lab, and I started to think more and more about what computers could do for us. My career, though, spans the introduction of personal computers and the internet. I remember typing manuscripts on typewriters. Usually you had somebody do that for you. In the 1990s, neuroscience, like many biomedical domains, began to adopt computers, as I just mentioned. And many of us started to see the potential of the internet and computers to transform the way we do science. There were a whole bunch of us around that were sort of thinking that the way we were doing things online, especially when it came to publishing, really wasn't the best way. And that movement came together as Force 11, Future of Research, Communications, and E-Scholarship, back in 2011. Most of the founders were scientists that came from different domains, but a lot of them from biomedical domains. So Force 11 itself is characterized as a grassroots effort to accelerate the pace and change of the nature of scholarly communications and e-scholarship. And it brought together groups that typically didn't interact as peers, researchers, scholars, publishers, librarians, technologists. It's still going. I shouldn't be using this in the past tense. They issued the Force 11 Manifesto, which outlined how to harness the new medium of the web for next-gen scholarly communications. And I wasn't particularly interested in this topic, but the first Beyond the PDF meeting was held in San Diego in a place called Cal IT, where I happen to have my office. And I saw that this workshop was going to be held, looked interesting, seemed to fit in the area of informatics, of taking scientific information and transforming it for the web. So I attended it. I think I'm one of the people in that photograph there, but I can't be sure. And I have to say that Beyond the PDF conference in 2011 was one of the most electric, if not the most electric conferences I ever attended. You could just see that there was a lot of new, exciting things that were coming around, but also a pent-up frustration that we were running into the walls of traditional publishing, and that we felt that back in those days that, of course, we really had to change the world, and it was very characterized by this revolutionary zeal, which you could see in my mad as hell comment in my blog. And there were several of these conferences, eventually changed from Beyond the PDF to the Force Conference, just for name branding. Mostly it was new tools and technology that were discussed. A lot of things that we use today were first introduced, I think, at the Force conferences, but there were really great discussions as well. And because we had the publishers and the technologists and librarians and the researchers all in the same room, and it really wasn't anyone trying to sell to anybody else, but rather to kind of discuss the collective problems that were associated with scholarly communication, I'd have to say that the discussions were often very frank and honest. So I remember when Dan O'Donnell, who was in the humanities, basically looked out to all the biologists in the audience and say, you know, other fields don't do authorship as stupidly you do in biomedicine, where you have the first author and the last author, and nobody else in between matters. He goes, there are many other ways to do this, and it should be obvious, but of course you're so steeped in your own traditions that you really don't think about it. And I remember a publisher sort of answering from the audience about one of the complaints that, things just seem to be exactly the same as they were before the internet. And a publisher just got up and he said, well, whether you like it or not, publishers got to the internet first. They got to the internet first, and they enshrined their practices for journal submissions and everything else before the rest of us even knew what hit us. And so, we like to think that software is infinitely malleable, but anybody who runs production systems for a large institution know that it is a thing of dread when you have to try to drastically change your software system. All kinds of things go wrong, and people are unfunctional for often months at a time. We just did that at UC, and it was a nightmare. Another comment that was made, and this was a publisher, we were in conversation, and I was complaining about formatting references, and he goes, the dirty little secret is you don't have to do that at all, right? Because all you need is the code, and we can pull all that information. And I was genuinely mad about that, because anybody who has formatted references, even in the age of reference managers, knows that it is just an exercise in frustration. But the title of my talk, as I mentioned, was really prompted by a specific talk that was at the Beyond the PDF in Amsterdam in 2013 by Kaveh Bazargan, who runs River Valley Technologies, which I'll talk about in a bit. And he got up and basically in the future session said, I'm going to tell you why articles should be published in XML and nothing else. And I thought that that was a very interesting thing. I was, a biologist, so I knew something about computers from my informatics work. I remember when XML was introduced and how much excitement there was about it. But his basic premise was that, that the way that we translated publications into the internet was essentially translating that final product, that nicely formatted article. And we also translated the 6,000 different formats that you can have for references, and the nearly as many different styles that you can have for articles. Do you make the methods first, last, whatever it is? And he pointed out, and I think it is true, that actually the scientific article is one of the most stereotyped things in the entire world. I've seen people black out all of the sections of a scientific article, and every one of us can still look at it and tell you exactly what it is. So, one of the things, as I said, that we translated to the web was the fact that we had to put everything in a specific format, and that burden was placed on the authors. We had to conform to the thousands of reference styles that had been put in place for apparently fairly stupid reasons. And all of this burden was placed on the researcher. And at the end, what you had was something that was very static and immutable, like a piece of paper. And it really was not necessary, right? He said that it's not a computable form. If you publish the articles in XML and have the XML as the version of record, then you can format it any way you wish. You can format it in any one of those 6,000 variations on a theme. You can format the references however you want. And the author doesn't have to do it, right? It's the publishers who do it, and it's done automatically because it knows how to read the XML, it knows how to read all of those codes. And you could see that new publishing platforms and things were coming online, Google Docs and others, that were really going to change the way that we authored papers. So, it really got me thinking, and, some of the many things that when you learned about them, you're like, wow, that's just really annoying. But this one really kind of struck me, and it struck me even before I knew much about text mining or got into text mining, because my lab does a lot of natural language processing, that this formatting was something that caused a whole lot of pain, and it really didn't return all that much benefit, not in the way that we were doing it. All it did was cause pain. So Kaveh, again, talked about this, and I got a little ahead of myself, and he developed this River Valley platform, and I went and I looked at it, and I see over here in 2019, he launched the world's first XML-based end-to-end publishing solution. So this conference was in 2013. Obviously, it's not the easiest thing in the world because it took him a while to get this out, but he basically said that we should be publishing in XML and nothing else. And I didn't take it to mean literally that it had to be XML. I mean, there are many different formats that you can use. New ones come out all the time, but that the underlying text should be separated from the formatting itself. And the formatting was the window dressing that you put on at the end, not the way you got it into the web in the first place. So really what all of these statements and Force 11 was showing, as I've mentioned already, is that we have too many practices that are still relics of the print age. It's actually kind of amazing that when we open a word processor, right, it gives us a printed sized page at this point, because it just assumes that we are still going to print it on a piece of paper and read it in that way. So we have a lot of restrictions on what we do, because this is the way that it's going to look in print. And one of the things, as I started my talk with, that is still a point of considerable pain, is that the U.S. National Institutes of Health, where I get almost all my funding, requires grant applications to conform to specific page limits, usually 12 pages, but it depends, different grants, different sizes. And at one point, after the switch to computers, which I remember, they came out with specific fonts that you had to use, specific fonts and specific font sizes and specific spacings on that font. So they even have on their website, adherence to font size, type, density, line spacing, and text color requirements is necessary to ensure readability and fairness. And apparently, I am guessing that after one could start to write on a word processor where you could make your print as tiny as possible and squish your lines together, that researchers started to abuse the 12-page limit. Now, I'm not against page limits because I review grants. I very much appreciate that the grant that is given to me is of a certain size, and also that the lines aren't squished together and the font is not really, really tiny. But in fact, relying on page limits and font sizes instead of something like word counts imposes a real cost on the research enterprise. That scenario that I told you has happened way too many times. I would say that the last 2 days of grant preparation are strictly geared towards formatting, not making it better, but just making everything fit. So I once joked in a tweet that my tombstone is going to be written in Arial 11 point. And So anyway, this was the sort of state in 2013. This was my mindset in 2013, which I clearly captured in that blog. And how are things now? So in terms of technology, I would say that there's a lot of things that are a lot better. At some point, I made the switch primarily to Google Docs. Google Docs was traditionally very bad at formatting, so you had to take things out of Google Doc and then put them into Word, usually, or some other program in order to format them correctly for NIH. But a lot of things are better. There's reference managers that work with Google Docs, which didn't happen before. So, you know, it actually is a lot better program than it was before. And I like it so much that if I have to compose in a desktop program, I kind of react to it, right? So I have made that switch to collaborative editing on programs like Google Docs. And I have to say, with all the things one might say about Google, it is a really nice product. And in fact, only recently, Google now realizes you don't have to constrain our work by the size of a page if we don't want to. And they kind of let you extend if you want to. And you're kind of like, no, I have to make it 8 by 10 or whatever it is. But in fact, you know, you can go off the page if you want. There are other platforms, you know, for collaborative editing, but as I said, Google is far and away my favorite. There are some attempts to start making our corpus in biomedicine available for text mining. As I'll talk about in a minute, very little of it is, but starting around 2019, they started to think about, instead of having to deal with this messy JATS formats and other formats that really, again, are formatting, that they should be making these things available for text mining in formats that are more computable, like XML and JSON. But the fact that I saw that article in 2019, again, says that this is not something that was new, right? This is something that really had to be put in place. But that page limit policy has not changed at all, and that 4 a.m. scenario still holds. Why? Again, Google Docs has gotten a lot better, but you really can't format the final thing in Google Docs. There's just a couple of things that don't quite work as well. There's not as good wraparound strategies and other types of things. And once you download a doc from Google Docs, especially if you're using a Macintosh, it's always a crapshoot. So this is an actual page from one of my recent grants that it looks like this in Google Doc. And then I blacked out the text or grayed out the text because I don't have permission to share it, but this table is fairly benign. And you can see this nice table, it's nicely formatted. Then when I download it on the Macintosh, you can see the text has jumped all around, and there's this little thing, which means that that table has disappeared someplace, and I'm going to have to try to retrieve it. Sometimes I just have to cut it out and repaste it in on the desktop. This type of formatting is still an exercise in frustration. It is tremendous pain in the neck. And in one of our last grant applications, where we were feverishly trying to cut things down, we were sharing documents amongst multiple different groups, and we would all download it from Google in Microsoft Word format. And I kept saying, oh, we're within the page limits. And the other person said, no, we're not within the page limits. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, it turned out that if you took the same document in Google Docs, saved it as a Word document, opened it in Pages, it was shorter. You can see that this is shorter, that the spacing, even though nothing has changed, is not exactly the same. And if you then open that document, that Word document, or save this Word document in from Pages as a Word document, you can see it's longer, it expands. So we're all going, and everyone's like, everybody thought that we were going crazy because we were all getting different page limits because we were right at the edge of that 12 pages. And you could see what a mess this is because every program seemed to open it in a different way. And we were kind of debating, we had to take the ruler out to say, is the spacing in Pages legitimate so that we could submit it? But then we realized you can't submit Pages as a format. It has to be a doc. Actually, I think you now have to do it all in PDF, but whatever it is, it's a pain in the neck. So I don't think that the interoperability of these programs is still good enough. And, you know, you can see that my resentment is coming up. I'm still mad at it. And, you know, why? It turns out, I'll show you in a minute, there was real consequences to this. So how are things now in terms of policies? Well, most publishers impose word and figure limits now for different types of articles. So you get so many words, and if you have a figure, it's so many words, it's worth so many words for different article types. And conferences, by and large, are word limits with figure counting for abstracts and things. And even some publishers are loosening requirements for formatting upon submission. I think that this is because there's now cascading reviews where if you submit to Wiley and it's rejected from their top tier journals, they'll cascade the reviews down to others. And so they're, in order to keep everything in the family, so to speak, they don't make you reformat the article until it's accepted. Integration with preprint services, I think, has also helped because some journals allow you to go right from something like bioRxiv and submit it directly to the journal without having to reformat it. And so most of them will let you format after a review is done. I should also say that I myself, especially since my first 11 days, tend to not pay attention to what the journal tells me to do. I just write that basic pro forma article in the introduction, methods, results, and discussion, and I submit it. And if they don't like it, you know, they can tell me. But since mostly I'm submitting to open access journals, I haven't had anybody reject me because I haven't formatted it yet. But of course, once the review is done, I actually have to go in and format it, which does make me mad in many occasions. But of course, your mood is much better after the article is accepted than when it's going through review. But I think one of the main things is too, back in 2013, the FAIR principles were, I think, about a year away. They were first published through Force 11 in the year 2014, and the paper came out in 2016. But you realize fundamentally that formatting is not fair, especially in the area of text. Text is data now, especially in the area of ChatGPT and these large language models. Everything that we say is a data point that gets now consumed by something else. And we've been complaining about this for a while, that especially in biomedicine, which is a very large corpus and is, of course, absolutely required that we integrate findings from all different scales, all different systems, all different techniques, that we should be able to easily mine the entire corpus of biomedicine without having to deal with restrictive licenses. So I mentioned, of course, that PubMed Central makes, and European PubMed Central make the articles published after a certain point available as open access, but because of the licenses, only about half of these are allowed to be mined. But there are still things about these articles that are very difficult to extract. I'll show you in a minute that tables are very difficult to extract in many cases from a lot of these articles that aren't perfectly formatted. So I would say that publishers may have gotten to the internet first, but really their obligations, in my view, have changed. Their obligations now are not to publish just for humans, but they are to publish for computers. And Google Docs now has a resident AI artist. And so if you want him to, or it to generate a figure for you, you just type in your theme. So I typed in the tyranny of formatting, and this is what it came up with. And it does kind of look, you know, tyrannical, and you can kind of see some formatting in there. I thought that was pretty funny. So anyway, I credit it to our Google Docs resident AI artist. So as I mentioned, there's still considerable difficulty in extracting certain things from articles. So my colleagues, Nita Bondrowski and Peter Ekman at UCSD, are using various algorithms to try to extract tables from bioRxiv preprints. And it turns out that even the state-of-the-art algorithms have a difficult time recognizing that there are tables. And once they do recognize it, they have a real hard time actually pulling out the table. So you can see here a table from this paper down here. It's a summary of spider genome repeat content. And you have these nice headings up here, but no little lines. And then you have this table here that has been, of course, formatted for a human being to read. And you can see that the computer can't deal with it. It doesn't figure out that these headings belong to this. It puts things in different places. Sometimes Peter tells me it can't recognize it at all and can't extract anything from it. So this formatting business that we have and making things formatted for human beings is still posing difficulties for machines. I was kind of thinking when I was putting this talk together that that might be a good science fiction story when that AI gets in and is, consuming all human knowledge and becomes all powerful, that we just have to stick formatting in the middle to completely flummox them because they'll misread everything. But I digress. So I think that coming back to the blog that I wrote, I had gone through these little exercises in the end saying, imagining a world without formatting, what would the world look like? And here I talk about submitting my article to Nature and it gets rejected, so I have to submit it to Glia. And they just take my XML files, they make it look very pretty. They advertise it, they sell this pretty version back to institutions so they can read it. And at the time, a lot of scholars were accusing the publishers of existing only to sell us formatting. And I said, that's okay. I pay for formatting all the time. I always pay extra for the floral patterns on the Kleenex boxes because it goes with my color scheme. I don't mind. But, the point is that the formatting is added afterwards and it's not making me have to do any more work. If I want to pay for it, I can pay for it. If I don't want to pay for it, I don't have to. I talk about text mining and the fact that now that maybe there's a global archive out there. This was before bioRxiv, and you would be able to get access to XML representations of all the articles in the world so that you didn't have to spend all that time trying to clean up, trying to figure out how to extract that tables or limit what you can do to the article just because of the fact that formatting gave you some trouble. Uniform access to the entire corpus in a form that's suitable for mining, I think, is one of the next goals that everybody needs to fight for. I believe it is absolutely essential. And here's my grant. I said, now that I have page word limits and figure limits, I don't have any problem. I've saved all that time. I'm largely done writing my grant proposal at 11 o'clock instead of 4 a.m. Needs to be 10,000 words. Each figure counts for 500 words. At 11 p.m. I'm 10 words over. I delete a sentence and I hit done. Nothing jumps around. Nothing, gets written over. 11:15, I'm getting ready for bed. Grant reviewers get a nifty program that allow them to view or print or read in a variety of formats depending on their medium. If you want to print things out on paper, go for it, but you can make it as large as you want and you're not staring at tiny figures because each figure can be as big as you want. The font's 18 points, so the grant's 40 pages long, but a younger reviewer with better vision who still likes paper chooses 11-point font. So some of this, of course, can be done with PDFs, but I think you get the idea. And the point is that we can still pose all of these limits on what you can write, but we don't have to make people spend 2 days trying to get things to fit into that 12 pages. So overall, I would say there has been progress since 2013. It's kind of fun going back and even looking at the programs that were listed that were brand new back then and are just starting out, and they've gotten a lot farther. They've become things that I use every day. But I would still say that we are still suffering from the tyranny of formatting, that it gets in the way too much, gets in the way even of data. You insert formatting into an Excel spreadsheet, it makes it much harder to read. And so this idea that we add formatting afterwards if we need it, but that everything gets published naked in some XML form, I think it is much better than it used to be, but I don't think that it is quite there yet. So I asked my AI artist to generate a freedom from formatting work of art, and this is what they produced. It looks vaguely liberating, I think, and hopefully that we will get there one day. So thank you very much for your attention, and I very much enjoyed revisiting what I was doing back in 2013. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Maryann. Questions, remarks, anybody? Stephen.
Thank you very much. I had a terrible experience this year. I submitted a paper to the web conference of all things, and I could submit either in Word or in LaTeX, So I write all my articles in a version of HTML because I think that that's most likely to be a long-lived format. I don't believe actually in Word as a long-lived format. I have papers that I wrote in an earlier version of Word that I can no longer read because Word
Right.
doesn't accept it anymore. But the annoying thing about this was that I had my paper in HTML. I had to, or XHTML actually, I had to convert it then into Word and submit that. They took that and converted into HTML. So that's just a comment, but
Yeah.
I long for the day that you describe that every conference just accepts the sensible way of doing it, which is just you're submitting paragraphs and headings and diagrams, and you don't care how it's formatted, and they can, whoever does care, can do it.
Yes. No, I agree. And I think when you asked me to if I'd like to sort of speak here, and I'm always a little I said intimidated by speaking at highly technical conferences because I'm sure that there are solutions to all of this if one codes or does anything else. But I don't. I see the comment that Debbie put in the in the chat about there's a real cost to this, right? There's a real cost to it, and that I think is just not calculated, or if it is, it's not known about, that we that is imposed on the creative enterprise. As I said, I don't mind putting time and effort into anything that actually helps spur creativity, helps refine your thought. There's a lot of things that we do. I mean, people complain about writing grants, and I said, oh yeah, don't like to have to write grants, but the process of creating the grant itself actually focuses your thinking. It lays out your research program, right? Writing abstracts, writing all of these things really sort of help you do your work. But then there's this extra cost, and I'm seeing right here, right, that up to 70% of their time was spent on doing things that don't really do anything at all. It's these changes in formats, and why, right? Why are we still imposing this on people? And I think I put that quote about the publishers got there first because, right, I had a colleague way back in the 1980s. He was actually a professor while I was transitioning from undergraduate to graduate. And he said the first use of a new technology is just usually a better version of the old technology. And he was sort of talking about how the fact that the first big use in personal computers that everybody used it for was simply word processing. They used it as a typewriter, only now you didn't need your little bottle of whiteout. So, right, it was better in that sense. But then we didn't master the medium, right? We didn't really master the medium and appreciate what we could do with this. Maybe had that happened way back when, as there was this huge technological flux in formats and everything, there would have been a lot of dead ends. But now, in my view, there's no excuse, right? Now that there's really no excuse. And if you want to put dollar signs on it, just look at how it ties people up for reasons that are trivial. I realized in my talk that I didn't give the outcome of one of these exercises in fonts where I had that rejected. We spent 2 to 3 months. It was a huge program project grant that we all we were putting together across multiple institutions that ended up being rejected because there was one section where somebody didn't check that there was less than 11 point, font was used. So they threw out the entire thing. And that one really, really got me angry because at the time I had a relative who was seriously injured and in the hospital, and I was actually writing the grant while I was in hospital waiting rooms, trying to do my part to get this in, and then to have it rejected for that. I mean, that was just criminal in my view, right? Criminal if you really think about it. So I do think, even though it's kind of a, as I said, tyranny is a little maybe over the top, I'm not actually so sure, right? I really do think it is almost quantifiable, the impact this has.
So your comment about new technology, what did you exactly say? New technology is just a better version of the old technology or something? Is that what you said?
Yes, yeah. So my friend, he's a friend and colleague at the time, was sort of talking about what personal computing was going to be able to do for us. Because remember, this was way back when in the late 70s, early 80s. And he was basically saying that when you get something new in, you often just use it as a better version of the old.
Exactly.
But you don't really say, oh, wait, we don't need to be constrained by the old. I mean,
well,
the fact that it took until 2023, at least when I saw Google saying, you don't have to have the 8 by 10 page limit there when you start to type. You can make it whatever you want. But how long did it take us to go, oh, I guess I really don't print anything out anymore. I don't have to care.
So,
right?
so one of my talks at the web conference was comparing the development of the book with the development of the web, and I pointed out that when book printing was first introduced in 1450, that books exactly looked like manuscripts. That they used a handwriting font. They didn't pay no page numbers, no table of contents, anything. It just looked like a manuscript, and that it took them 50 years before they had a bright idea of using readable fonts and page numbers and tables of contents and indexes and stuff. And my question, I was questioning, well, why did it take 50 years? And I believe that we are still in that period of the internet where we are imitating the old ways. We're still pretending that we're using paper. And my unfortunate conclusion was that I believe the old generation who knew the old ways have to die before we can move to how it should really be used. And we won't see the internet used as it really should be used until the old generation of dead. And
From the first user of the internet in Europe. There are more people who want to chime in. I think Sid Bauman.
Sid has a question, comment.
Both. Thank you very much, ma'am. This is an impressive talk. I really liked it, although it did make me really angry with myself that I decided not to go to UCSD in 2010 or thereabouts for the PDF Beyond the PDF conference. I'm kind of kicking myself now, but I'll only start with one. There are 40 things that this brings up. The first thing I'll say in reverse chronological order in response to something you just said, in response to Stephen, that this tyranny, you're not sure it's the right word, is it really that bad? It has imposed a significant cost. I'm going to suggest that not only has it imposed the significant cost you've described, but it's also imposed another cost upon us as a society, because it has shifted the concept of editing away from editors and to authors. How often have you driven down the highway and looked at a billboard that probably cost $7,000 or $8,000 to put up, and seen that they use an open quotation mark where there should have been an apostrophe, or they spelled the word wrong? That didn't used to happen. That's the fault of this computational word processing thing.
I agree. No, I agree on that. And, I was just writing a piece that I think should come out soon on this whole transition from closed data to open data, where now, of course, in biomedicine, like many places, you have to share your data. And they're trying to shift all the burden of data preparation to people who have exquisite skills in the laboratory to do what they need to do. And now they're supposed to learn all of this, and they're terrible at it, and they don't spend time on it, but it's a different skill. It's a different skill set. It's a different set of expertise. And I'm basically saying, you need to really focus on getting the curators and getting, customer service representatives and others who take away this burden. They need to do what they need to do because they have the deep knowledge of the data, but they're not good at formatting it for generic consumption, right? It's not what they do. So it's sort of that same thing. And I think they're going to make the same mistake with data as they did with text in this way, right? It's a degradation in quality.
a really
And
good
also
point.
a waste of time, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that also feeds into another point I
Mhm.
had, which is that you suggested that the publishers um, may have gotten to the internet first, but their responsibility has shifted. And I'm not sure I agree with that, but certainly preparing the data should you want the publishers to take on the responsibilities that are not the intellectual content and let the scientists and the English majors and the authors focus on the intellectual content and let people who are good at data management handle formatting the data for whatever consumption pattern it is. I personally think it's been the publishers, that was their responsibility all along. And it's not that the responsibility has shifted, it's that we, the scientific community, are finally starting to make them live up to those responsibilities. I hope.
Yes, and so I see your point, and what I really meant by that was this: you are now publishing also in a form that, right, that you need to allow text mining and other things, right? So you're no longer binding up volumes and shipping them to libraries. And that's really what I was talking about. And whether they have the expertise or not. And it was really interesting, again, going through Force 11 and listening to publishers, that there was just a whole lot of expertise they didn't have in their old model, right? I mean, I learned that when finally they realized they were going to have to scan everything into PDFs, they didn't have copies of any of the journals because they bound them up and they shipped them to the libraries. The libraries, ironically, they had to go back to them to get their old content in order to be able to scan it and then sell it back to the library, right? So, I mean, there was all these really interesting things in there. But, right, the fact that we can only text mine this very small corpus in biomedicine, in my view, can't hold, right? Because it's such a large field with so many small units published that unless we really can mine the entire corpus to start, looking at what's going on across the little units that we publish, we're not going to be able to put it all together. And they started a while back. I think there was something called Chorus when PubMed Central came out and said, hey, we're going to make all this available. But it's not just making it available to humans. Their infrastructure has to change, or their models have to change so that we can, right, provide this access. There ought to be, with reasonable effort, you should be able to mine the entire corpus. I don't care, how that is done, but you might say it's both the publisher and maybe the library's, responsibility to allow this to happen. So that's really what I meant there, because I do
Maryann,
agree with about the others.
Fair enough.
Maryann, thank you.
I'll stop
Sid,
there.
thank you.
Okay.
We have to cut it short now. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Well, thank you for listening, and thank you for giving me the opportunity.